Edgar Arceneaux, artist and creator of the show Boney Manilli, that's going to be playing at Red Cat in Los Angeles. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh yeah, it's great. Great to meet you, Craig.
I want to start by asking about something you told ArtNet in 2020, where you said the power of what art is its unruliness, its nature to ask new questions. Is that the guiding principle for you when you embark on any project? And if so, what was the principal question you wanted to ask with Boney Manilli?
Yeah. I mean, because its nature is to be interpreted, it means that each person's individual perspective is important, and that it's in that space of difference, is in that space of debate where its power comes from, which is different than, say, an advertisement or maybe even an illustration, which is meant to be instrumentalized. But I think that art's power comes from its unwillingness to be fully turned into one meaning or one message. In the case of Boney, you know, confusion is part of that unruliness, and it's confusion on two different sides. So on one side, it's a writer director by my name, a character that I named after myself, Edgar, who's struggling to write a play about Milli Vanilli. And every time he thinks he has it, then it slips away. And at the same time, he's trying to take care of his mother, who's slowly dying from dementia and is forgetting everything. So it's sort of like this pull between the two, because as the story goes on, Edgar becomes increasingly mad and obsessed, to the point where he risks sort of tearing everything apart. There's a brother in the middle of the story. His name is Bro, and he's the younger brother, and he's also trying to tell a story, but this one is centered around the Song of the South, the story that Walt Disney Studios made into a film. And he's convinced, and everyone else in the family is convinced, that movie was actually written by their grandfather and that Disney stole it from them. So all of them are trying to tell a story before the mother passes away.
You said that the Edgar in the play, keeps trying to write this play, but it keeps slipping away from him. How often do you find ideas or projects that you're doing slipping away from you? I mean, if you're going to name the character after yourself, I'm wondering how much of you is in this?
Quite a bit, but there's two different aspects of the character. So there's the one that's struggling with the story and kind of the frustration that comes along with that. But then also he's struggling with the economic insecurity, where he hopes that this thing is going to be able to get him out of the hole that he's in. He's living with his mother again, and he hopes that this is going to get him out of that hole. But then there's also the kind of madness that happens to people, that can happen to you when you're taking care of a loved one who's going through either dementia or Alzheimer's, because they go from being the person who's there to nurture you to you becoming the person that nurtures them. And that pressure for some people can cause them to become a version of themselves that they don't like. And even though my mother and I, we had an amazing relationship up until the day that she passed, I did recognize in myself the capacity to become a really terrible person, because of the emotional weight and responsibility. But also it just really kind of tears and breaks everything apart, when the mother, or especially when the mom is dealing with an illness.
Yeah, I went through it my mother passed away when I was 35. So I know what that's about. But I found the thing that I learned out of that experience, and I don't know if this was the same for you, Edgar, was you also recognize how strong you are and how much you can handle, because there's no manual for this.
No. Yeah, there is an aspect of it where you do become another another person, if you will. I do remember that there was a moment where my mom was just really, really falling apart. And I had to um I had to put her in the shower. And, you know, my mother is a very proper Catholic woman, and she would just die from the thought of her son having to undress her and kind of, you know, bathe her. But within 15 seconds of like having to do that with her, I was just like, oh, this is what she needs. And I'm gonna do it because, you know, I love her, and, you know, she needs the help, and I'm gonna give it to her because there's no one else to do it. And it was really, for me, afterwards, I realized it was a gift because I wouldn't want to give that responsibility to another person, you know.
And the reality is you may not have that choice.
It was no choice. Yeah, it was either me or no one.
Right. But you may be in a position later in life when you don't have a choice, where somebody has
Yeah.
to do that for you.
Yeah, you do recognize, because I have a daughter now, she's 17, and when you start seeing the bookends of life, you it is you just have it shifts your perspective around you know around life and love and relationships. And, you know, I do hope that my daughter would want to take care of me in the same way.
Well, chances are she will.
Hopefully. They say boys are more likely to put you in a home than daughters.
Well, you've in a podcast that UCLA Arts did with you a year ago as a work in progress, you talked about how these characters go through a baptism of fire.
Mm.
I'm wondering if you've been through a catharsis through the process of creating and bringing this show to life.
Oh man, yeah, you know, I'm not sleeping very much these days because we're in the middle of working on a show. So you're asking me all these like big emotional questions. So I'll do my best to answer. But yeah, most certainly. And, you know, this version of the show, because this is actually the fourth expression of this project over the last 6 years. This is the first one where I felt like I really could use the aspects of how dementia impacts your mind as a kind of organizing principle for how to tell the story. And when we did it as a work in progress presentation last March, it was impossible for me to really, you know, tell the story from that perspective because my mom had just passed away a year before. Um, but now, you know, going into 3 years after her passing, that can be a little more objective. I'm a little more settled um, in the um, in the absolute reality, the undeniable reality that she's no longer physically here. Um, and that's given me a bit of creative distance to be able to really dig in to it in a way in which I just couldn't do before.
Of course, I mean, it does get easier. It never gets easy, but it does get easier.
Yeah, yeah. It's getting there, and I recognized, you know, I had this kind of beautiful moment last night because I was with my dad, and I had just taken him out to dinner, and we were sitting on the bed, and then I finished like the final edit of the script, and I sent it to all the management team and the designers. And I realized I was sitting on my mom's side of the bed when I like sent that final email off. And it felt really, you know, in a subtle way. It I don't know. There was something about it that was very poetic, and I couldn't have timed it that way, you know. I couldn't have timed it.
Yeah, couldn't have timed it nor designed it.
Yeah.
It was you know, that was completely, you know, subconscious thing that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yes. Yeah, your question is very succinct.
Yeah. So Boney Manilli combines two problematic components of popular culture. There was, of
Mm.
course, Milli Vanilli, and there's Song of the South, both of which have their own baggage that go along with them. What was the impetus for combining these two into one story?
Real life. You know, what I say to to artists and to my students when I'm talking to them, I usually ask them a little bit about their biography before I talk to them about their work, because, these experiences, they shape the contours of the lens by which you see the world, the particular scrapes and scars that, that will allow you to see certain things and maybe dissuade you from others. And at a certain point in the process of researching and writing and thinking about Milli Vanilli and also Boney M, and this mysterious music producer, Frank Farian, who created both of these groups, using avatars, to great fortune for him. I realized that part of the contours of my own lens was the story that my own grandfather was that his story was stolen by Walt Disney, because he did write a script and send it to them. And then 2 years later, my mom was a little girl, she saw it on the big screen and couldn't believe it. And up until this day, they were convinced that that was my grandfather's story, and that it was stolen from us. And what added to the mystery was that my mom had the script, but she hid it somewhere, and then when the dementia kicked in, she forgot where it was, and we were never able to find it. So as I started to think about the relationship between these two stories, the one about the potential theft, and then the way in which Joel Chandler Harris, the person who's credited with these stories, actually just collected them from people who lived either on his plantation of his grandfather, or other Blacks who had these oral traditions. And then he created this character called Uncle Remus as essentially in the same way that Rob and Fab existed, as these kinds of these fictional placeholders for a white author's voice. I recognize that these two stories are coming together, but I couldn't leave those two things together alone without recognizing that there was a third element which was produced by juxtaposing these two things, which is the way in which there's an industry of entertainment that values and monetizes this kind of trauma. And the show is very critical of our desire to learn about the stories of people who've been taken advantage of.
Right. And Frank Farian and Walt Disney both did that.
They did that, but also we as an audience, and the camera, the lens of this show is very much focused on the appetite of the audience for these kinds of stories. So when you come and see it, you'll see how we try to turn the camera from the stage to the audience. And
it's funny.
I think some interesting ways.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I don't think the audience knows its role or thinks it has a role somehow.
I mean, I sometimes I find myself doom scrolling on Instagram, and the algorithm likes showing me stuff about space and science, and then also stuff of like people crashing their bicycles, or like slipping on banana peels. It's got my number, like those are the things I like, that I find myself spending time with. And if that was me slipping on a banana peel and somebody posted it on Instagram, I would be mortified, But from a certain distance, we just find it as a kind of visual candy, and we just move on. And I recognize that as a culture, we tend to monetize and to turn these experiences into units, and we like to see shows about people talking about their trauma or how they were exploited by a white industry. And my show is aware of that history and is also being critical of it as well.
Right. Well, there's verbiage that CAP UCLA uses, in laying out information about this show. And they say, quote, "To paint the picture of identity and infamy within its true reality is Arceneaux's artistry at its best." We're living in a time when identity is being discussed far more openly and with perhaps greater acceptance than it has in quite some time. Mm-hmm. But it's going hand in hand with, a culture vis-a-vis Instagram and other social media aspects that allow us to manufacture our identity at the same time, which doesn't necessarily have any basis in reality. What do you see as the present day reality of how we are looking at identity?
Well, again, like being a teacher, I have to thank like the LGBTQ community for making us aware of how pronouns work. I joke to myself that now that I call everyone them and they, that it actually just makes it much easier for me to communicate with people because then I don't have to use pronouns at all. I'm just like, thank you for making my communication with everyone so much easier. I don't have to say he and she anymore. I just say them. Like, thank you. It's a good innovation. But you know, the question of how we see ourselves, how we label ourselves, is I think it goes hand in hand with lens-based technologies that sort of forces us to quantify where we begin and where another person ends. I think the more pluralistic understanding of race, class, identity is really good for us as a republic. I do think that it's butting up against the edges of what's now like grand monopolies and grand pooling of resources, both politically and economically, which is fortifying itself against this desire for a more diversified, um, more of a plateau as opposed to giant pyramids of power. And so these things are pushing against each other, and these monopolies are ways of reinforcing heteronormative ideas about ourselves. But the thing which is funny about Frank Farian's strategy of either using his own voice and then using Black avatars, which I'm certain he didn't only do that with just Black people, but these technology has made it super easy for everyone to do that now. And it's a movement that happens quite literally with all technology, that is something that just a few people have access to and harness, and then eventually it trickles itself down to a kind of prosumer level where we all get to harness these tools, and it's producing quite a bit of confusion. But I think that at a certain point all this stuff kind of settles. This is probably a much longer answer than you wanted, but these are the things that I think about.
Well, the cultural landscape is also changing as well. I mean, we're seeing more and more, institutions that present culture in both smaller and the largest possible capacities, giving more opportunities to people of color in a way that they hadn't done, say, pre-George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
Are you optimistic that the shift that we're seeing right now is going to be a lasting one?
Well, I'm happy to see more people of color participating in the art world than ever. I'll just speak about it within my sphere of influence. So than ever. And that broadening of voices and perspectives will ensure that the industry can continue to live and thrive and to grow. But because the arts are inherently dependent upon subsidy, the haves and the have-nots are always going to be in a position of sort of imbalanced power, where the few who have the resources and the many who need them is always a little bit out of whack. So as far as the diversity piece goes, I think that will continue to grow. My concern is that with the faces changing and the cultures changing and the identity shifting, will we still maintain these same imbalances of power? Because it doesn't matter if it's a person who's, Black or Chinese or Mexican, if they're still going to squash the person beneath them. It doesn't, it's not a real change, it's just the same system.
Right. And power dynamics are always going to be the same ultimately.
Not always. I mean, I think that, that one of the good things about social media is that it does allow everyone to be, and if they decide to, their own producer, and they can have their own platform to distribute their content. So, I mean, there is a many more avenues for us to express ourselves. But I think that like the consolidation of these platforms and the ways in which they've sort of become these giant monopolies is it's such a problem. I actually I'm not certain how we're going to work our way out of that.
Well, let's hope we do.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. In that same UCLA Arts podcast, you talked about that there's a certain letting go of all the rules that accompanies dementia. And I feel like your work on a certain level is about letting go of a lot of the rules that we are brought up to expect. Were there any specific rules that you wanted to let go of in creating Boney Manilli?
Oh yeah. Well, I would say like really big picture is that, I'm not trained in the performing arts. I kind of jumped in with both feet and just learned along the way and surrounded myself by a lot of people that were smarter than me and understood these domains of the, how to design a show, how to promote a show, how to market a show, how to write a script. So, and the really big picture of things, throwing myself into something where I'm absolutely a beginner is the most disruptive thing that you can do. But I would say, like, as far as how we work together as a team, I really try to treat it like we're in an art studio, which for many actors and designers is not common. Most of my team is from, I would say 90% of them are from Cal Arts. I'm a Cal Arts graduate as well. And it's just a certain way in which you can collaborate and leave spaces and gaps for people to bring stuff into it that allows a project to just grow in ways in which you could never determine. And my way of doing that is super dynamic and it's kind of a flow. And for some people, it can be super frustrating and disorienting. But for me, it just allows for something to congeal that feels very chaotic in the beginning. And once it settles, and I often can see the big picture, even though I can't really define all the edges. But then once it starts to congeal together, it becomes something really wonderful and super magical. But part of that is just learning how to let go and just trust in the process,
Is there an element of that, that I think you might share with a lot of other artists and professionals that I've spoken to, which is they're most excited about doing something that scares them? Was doing something like this show something that scared you, and that was an added impetus for doing it?
I mean, the reason why I've been working on this project for 6 years is because the first 3 iterations were not great. I mean, I was sweating. Like, I just like, you don't, I mean, it's the worst feeling in the world to have an audience watching something of yours and you know that it's not right. And you're just cringing on the inside. Also because putting on these shows is so expensive. And as a working class person, and you've raised this money from other people, you're like, you want to do the best that you can. And sometimes you're just not there. And you just have to keep working at it, but you have to keep keeping faith that you're going to get there. But there's no indication that for certain that you will. And you just sweat and sweat and sweat and sweat. And then at a certain point, I was just like, oh, I see the story now. Because I never could find the ending. I couldn't write it. For 5 years, I couldn't write it. I couldn't find it. And then I did.
And the results will be on display very soon.
Yes. Yes. Will be on display.
One last thing I want to ask you, Edgar. After your mother's funeral, you quoted her, I believe, on Instagram, and you said, she said to you, "Just because my body ain't here, don't mean I'm not still with you. I will always be 2 steps behind you, just right there when you need me." How has your mother been there with you through the creation and the rehearsals for Boney Manilli?
Oh man. Yeah. I mean, that example of just like sitting on the bed, with her last night is one example. But she was a person who had like just kind of like an unyielding faith in me and my siblings. And, oftentimes I would hear her voice or I can feel, some inkling that I was doing right by her in the story. But I when I was after she passed, I could feel her energy, all around me, in the natural environment around me. And I would often just rely upon that that belief to stay grounded and keep the faith that this was going to be a great show.
Well, she'll probably be there on opening night with you too.
I am 100% certain that she'll be there.